Think about any time you've worked in a team, especially when the people around you see the world in totally different ways. It's fascinating, isn't it?
Oh, yeah.
Because the way a team figures things out together isn't just like a sum of individual thoughts. So how do those really sharp, diverse teams, the ones that break new ground, actually work? What makes their collective intelligence tick?
That's the core of what we're exploring today. And we're not just guessing. We've got a real-world example that throws a lot of light on this.
Exactly. For this deep dive, you shared some compelling stuff about the early days of a team at the National Institute for Science Education, or NIS.
Okay.
This wasn't your average group. They brought together experts from fields like mathematics, astronomy, anthropology, education, engineering, and even political science.
That's why the roster.
Right, their big challenge.
Yeah.
To create a way to evaluate these large-scale science education reforms funded by the National Science Foundation. So right away, what we see here is that bringing together very different experts isn't just about having more knowledge. It's about creating a new way of thinking together, something called distributed cognition we'll dig into.
And what makes this story so relevant for you, the listener, is that we get to see how this diverse group tackled those initial hurdles, figuring out their purpose, sharing their varied knowledge, and starting to make concrete progress. Whether you're on a team at work, involved in a community project, or even just tackling a tough problem with friends who have different viewpoints, the dynamics we'll uncover here are incredibly valuable. Think of this as a shortcut to understanding the often messy but ultimately powerful process of effective teamwork.
Absolutely. And to really understand how this NICE team operated in those early days, we're going to look at a concept called distributed cognition. Okay, let's unpack this a bit.
Yeah, let's do that.
Instead of thinking that a team's intelligence just lives inside each person's head, distributed cognition says that the thinking is spread out. It exists in the team members, the tools they use like whiteboards or shared documents, and even the environment they're working in.
Precisely. It's like distributed across the whole system. And by zeroing in on a really important early meeting of this NICE team, we can see how this idea of distributed cognition helps us understand what was really going on.
Right.
Why did some ideas gain momentum and become central to their work? Why did other seemingly good ideas just, well, disappear? And ultimately, how did they start to produce real results or sometimes not?
So let's dive into this idea of individual versus distributed cognition. For a long time, the way we thought about intelligence was very much focused on what happens inside a single brain. But this idea of distributed cognition suggests a completely different picture.
Yeah.
Right.
It's a fundamental shift in perspective, yeah. Instead of thinking as a solitary activity, it's about understanding it as something shared, something that stretches beyond individual minds and is deeply connected to the group and its surroundings.
Okay.
This idea draws a lot from something called situated cognition, which highlights how our actions and the tools we use shape our thoughts. Think of how a chef's understanding of cooking evolves through the actual act of cooking with their specific knives and pans.
Right. It's not just abstract knowledge. It's knowledge that's tied to what we actually do, like embodied knowledge almost.
Exactly. And it also relates to information processing theory. In this context, it encourages us to think of teams as systems that take in information, process it through discussion and collaboration, and produce outputs, much like an individual's mind. The key difference is that with distributed cognition, these processes aren't confined to one person. They're spread out.
Okay, so with that different way of thinking about team intelligence, let's focus on this NICE team, the Strategies for Evaluation of Systemic Reform Team, or SESR. You mentioned their diverse backgrounds. Can you paint a picture of the kind of expertise they brought to the table?
Yeah, this was a very deliberately put together group designed to bring a wide range of perspectives. You had people with backgrounds in mathematics, which brings a real focus on logic and quantitative analysis.
Right.
Astronomy, which can offer a way of thinking about large, complex systems and observation from a distance. Anthropology, which emphasizes understanding cultural context and human behavior.
Okay.
Education, bringing direct experience with the very systems they were meant to evaluate. Engineering, with its problem-solving and design-oriented approach. And even political science, which focuses on the policy and power dynamics that are always part of large-scale reforms.
That's quite a mix of ways of seeing the world. So what was the common thread? What was the goal that brought all these different experts together?
Well, their main goal was to develop a solid, well-reasoned way to evaluate how effective these big systemic efforts to improve STEM education were the ones being funded by the National Science Foundation.
Right.
Ultimately, they were tasked with advising the NSF on how to best measure the impact of these initiatives. And what's so valuable for us is that the researchers who studied this team had access to a really rich set of data, recordings of their meetings, and very detailed notes taken during their early work.
So we get a real behind-the-scenes look at how this group of sharp minds started to tackle this really complex problem. It wasn't all smooth sailing from the beginning, was it? It sounds like those initial meetings were really about finding their footing.
Exactly. The first couple of team meetings were really characterized by this initial period of getting to know each other, trying to understand what systemic reform meant from each other's perspectives, and just, getting their heads around the very broad nature of the task they face.
Right.
There was a clear need for more specific information about the actual NSF-funded projects they were supposed to be evaluating.
It sounds like everyone was coming at it with their own professional language and assumptions based on their field. That must have been tricky.
Oh, absolutely. That's a key challenge in any interdisciplinary work. They had to find common ground, those overlapping ideas and shared understandings. Interestingly, the researchers observed an informal apprenticeship phase in those early meetings.
Oh.
Yeah, the team members who had more experience with systemic reform, often those from education or related areas, were informally guiding and explaining things to those who were less familiar with the terminology and the overall landscape of these initiatives.
So the more seasoned folks were kind of showing the ropes to the newcomers, helping them get up to speed.
In a way, yes. And as a concrete step towards building a shared understanding, the team leader and the project assistant took the initiative to create a matrix.
Ah, the matrix.
Yeah, this was a document that laid out the key features of various NSF-funded projects, things like where they were located, what grade levels they focused on, their main objectives, and who was in charge of evaluating them. It was meant to be a learning tool for the whole team.
A visual way to help everyone get a clearer picture of what these reforms actually look like in practice, a kind of map.
Precisely. Now let's move forward to their third meeting. This seems to be a real turning point where this idea of distributed cognition really starts to become more visible. What made this particular meeting so important?
Well, the agenda for that third meeting was pretty significant. They were supposed to reflect on a conference. They just organized a conference where they gathered questions about how to evaluate systemic reform from a wider community of practitioners and researchers.
No, gather input.
And they also needed to start planning for their proposal for the following year of funding from the NSF. So big stuff.
And it was in this third meeting that something new and important happened. For the first time, the group collectively created a tangible thing right there in the room. A list of key tasks that they wrote down together on a blackboard. This wasn't something that had been prepared in advance by the leadership. It came directly out of the group's discussion.
That sounds like a real moment of the team starting to gel, moving from just talking about things to actually defining concrete actions together. So what exactly were these action items that made it onto the blackboard?
There were 6 specific things the team brainstormed and agreed on. First, they listed distillation of workshop questions, meaning they needed to go through and synthesize all the questions that had come out of their recent conference.
Okay, makes sense of the input.
Second was descriptive work on what's happening, which suggested they wanted to get a better handle on the current state of systemic reforms. Third, they noted the need to look at existing assessments and assessment methods already being implemented by NSF-SR's systemic reforms.
See what's already out there.
Exactly. The fourth item was to look across the SR evaluations to get a picture of methods used and determine what's missing and see if these gaps can be filled. Fifth, they wanted to determine how SR dollars are spent by some categories by evaluating existing SR evil docs.
All of the money.
Yep. And finally, the sixth item was quite ambitious, to actually do an evaluation to apply the SESR team's findings, develop idealized evil designs in out years.
Wow, so actually try it out themselves eventually.
Yeah.
That's a pretty comprehensive to-do list, covering everything from analyzing existing information to potentially conducting their own evaluations. It really shows the team starting to define the practical steps of their work.
Right.
But you mentioned that some ideas that had been talked about a lot before this brainstorming session didn't make it onto the list. That's where things get really interesting. Can you give us an example of that?
Yeah, a particularly clear example was a 15-minute discussion that happened earlier in the meeting. It focused on the importance of attitudes in systemic reform. Yeah, several team members strongly agreed that for any real reform to take hold, you needed to see changes in attitudes among teachers, students, parents, school leaders, the whole system.
Okay, that makes sense.
It was a lively discussion with several people adding their thoughts, and no one disagreed with the point. A key insight here for you, the listener, is to recognize how easily important ideas can get lost if the process isn't designed to capture and act on them, even when there's broad agreement.
So it sounds like a key idea that really resonated with the team,
Right.
but it didn't end up on that action list. Why do you think that happened?
Well, several things likely played a role. One important factor was how the brainstorming session was set up. The team leader specifically asked, "What can we do that's practical?"
Ah, the framing.
Exactly. This focus on practical, doable actions might have unconsciously pushed people towards more concrete tasks and away from more abstract ideas like attitudes. Even though everyone thought they were important, it's not immediately obvious how you turn attitudes are important into a practical action item you can write on a blackboard.
That makes a lot of sense. The way you frame the question really shapes the kind of answers you get. What else might have contributed to that?
The team leader's own primary focus likely played a part. As he saw it, the team's main job was on the evaluation of systemic reform rather than on defining what reform itself should look like.
So less about the what and more about the how to measure it.
Right. So while he probably agreed that attitudes were important, he might have seen that as more of a characteristic of reform rather than something their team would directly evaluate in these early stages. There's also the simple factor of memory. The discussion about attitudes happened earlier in the meeting, and by the time they got to the brainstorming, that specific conversation might not have been at the forefront of everyone's minds. Things just fall away sometimes.
It's interesting, though, that even though attitudes didn't make that official action list, it wasn't completely forgotten, was it?
No, that's a crucial point to note. The project assistant and the team leader actually did include the topic of attitudes in the official minutes they prepared after the meeting, which suggests they recognized its significance.
So it's stuck in their minds, at least.
Yeah, and in a later interview, the team leader even referred back to the idea, using the term beliefs, and emphasized how important that observation about reform was for his own thinking. He even mentioned using that concept in discussions with people at NSF and in his own study of relevant materials. So even though it didn't lead to immediate group action, the attitudes idea persisted within the team's overall thinking, especially in the mind of the team leader.
Which brings us to the influence of leadership and individual cognition. The team leader clearly had a significant role in shaping the direction of the conversation, as we saw with the focus on practical actions and the earlier steering away from the attitudes discussion.
Absolutely. His goal-oriented approach and his strong focus on the team's core mission of evaluation heavily influenced what was discussed and what ultimately gained traction. He was consciously trying to guide the team towards what he believed were their most important objectives.
Yeah.
This brings us to a critical aspect of team dynamics: the role of the person guiding the process, the leader, and how their own thinking influences what the team focuses on.
And you also mentioned how the team leader and the project assistant's individual understanding their own mental models or frameworks, their schemas, influenced how they interpreted and recorded the meeting.
Yes, their existing understanding of the team's goals and the purpose of the meetings acted as a kind of filter. For example, concerns raised by some team members about the group being too theoretical, or questions about their specific roles seemed to be less prominent or reframed in the meeting minutes. The minutes, in a sense, reflected the meeting through the lens of the team leader and assistant's individual interpretations, which wasn't necessarily a perfect record of the entire group's distributed thinking. This highlights that even in a collaborative environment, individual perspectives and priorities can significantly shape how a group's interactions are understood and documented.
Now, the team leader and assistant also put a lot of effort into creating these instrumental products, these tools like the matrix and the case study, to help the team. But it sounds like their reception wasn't universally positive. What happened there?
That's a key observation. While these documents were created in response to the team's stated need for more information about existing reforms, some members found them to be not quite what they needed. One team member famously said that the matrix helps a bit, but you've got to get a feel for what's going on with reforms. I don't have a good feel for the range.
So it wasn't giving them that intuitive understanding they were looking for.
Exactly. Despite the considerable effort put into summarizing a lot of information, the final product didn't fully meet the diverse needs within the team for a more, well, gut-level understanding.
So there was a gap between what the team collectively felt they needed and what was centrally produced for them. Why do you think that gap existed?
Well, several factors could be at play. One is that a general request for information from a diverse group actually represents a lot of slightly different underlying needs and perspectives, right?
Yeah.
When that request is filtered through the individual understanding of the project assistant, who is primarily responsible for creating these documents, the resulting product might not perfectly align with everyone's specific way of understanding or their particular requirements. Additionally, the product assistant was also trying to meet the needs of other stakeholders, specifically the people evaluating the systemic initiatives themselves when creating these materials, which further complicated the goal of directly serving the NIST team's immediate needs. It's like trying to create a one-size-fits-all solution when everyone really needs something slightly tailored.
Yeah, makes sense. What about the conference proceedings? That was another instrumental product. How did the team engage with that?
That's interesting, too. The team leader had envisioned the group using the conference proceedings as a starting point to really dig into and refine the questions that had been generated. However, the team's response was a little different.
Oh, how so?
While they acknowledged the proceedings, they didn't actively start refining the questions during that meeting. Instead, they put distillation of workshop questions as the very first item on their Blackboard action list.
Right, we mentioned that.
So they were essentially recognizing that this task needed to be done, but without taking it on themselves right then and there. It was as if they recognized the value of the product, but preferred to postpone the active work of engaging with it. Maybe it felt too big for that moment.
So we see a contrast here. The tools that were created centrally weren't fully embraced, while the action list that the team generated together seemed to have more immediate support, at least initially. Is there a lesson there about how these kinds of tools are developed?
That's a really important point. The researchers suggested that products that come out of distributed cognition from the whole group working together, like that Blackboard list, might be a better fit for the team's needs and lead to a greater sense of ownership and commitment.
Yeah, buy-in.
Exactly. In contrast, tools developed mainly by a leader or a small number of people might feel less relevant or require more effort for the rest of the team to really integrate into their thinking. However, and this is a big however, it's also worth noting that the team leader didn't actively follow up on the whiteboard list in their subsequent meetings.
Oh, really? So it just kind of sat there.
Pretty much. So while the shared creation might have sparked initial enthusiasm, its long-term impact was limited by the lack of continued focus from the leadership.
This brings up a really fundamental question then. If the team's collaboratively generated output wasn't consistently acted upon, and the centrally produced tools weren't always a perfect fit, then what was the real value of bringing this interdisciplinary team together in the first place? Was it worth it?
That's the big question, isn't it? And the researchers looked closely at how the team leader and the project assistant viewed the team's purpose. Interestingly, both saw the team primarily as a surrogate audience.
A surrogate audience, what does that mean?
The idea was that the diverse backgrounds and different levels of familiarity with systemic reform within the team provided a valuable way to gauge how different stakeholders might understand and react to the ideas and evaluations that were being developed.
So they were a kind of built-in focus group to test ideas on, see if they made sense to different kinds of people.
In a sense, yes. They could point out areas that were confusing, ask for clarifications from their different disciplinary perspectives, and offer insights that help the leadership refine their communication and their overall thinking about systemic reform.
That's a useful function, definitely.
Yeah.
But it sounds like the team's contributions went even deeper than just being a sounding board, from what you were saying earlier.
Absolutely. Perhaps the most surprising and significant finding was the substantial way the team actually contributed to the team leader's individual understanding and the development of his own theory of evaluation.
Ah, so the impact wasn't just on the group, but on the leader himself.
Yes, deeply. In interviews, the team leader specifically credited various team members' comments, analogies they used, and their different disciplinary perspectives as directly influencing his thinking and even leading him to explore new research and theoretical frameworks that he hadn't considered before.
Wow. Can you give us some specific examples of how the team influenced his thinking? That sounds really powerful.
Certainly. He mentioned how a mathematician on the team sparked a whole new line of inquiry related to quantitative reasoning and evaluation. Another member who had a background in poverty research led him to start looking at economic models of evaluation.
Different lenses, different directions.
Exactly. A comment someone made about epidemiological models got him exploring literature from the CDC on different types of analysis. He even talked about a rocket scientist on the team whose analogy of thinking about systemic reforms as complex galaxies rather than simple experiments had a lasting impact on how he understood the whole process.
Galaxies. That's a cool analogy for complexity.
Isn't it? He also highlighted a team member's perspective on reform as being fundamentally about belief, connecting back to that attitudes discussion, and another's concern about funding being diverted away from basic research. And even a comment from a new team member about the importance of focusing on what was actually happening at the classroom level really resonated with him.
It sounds like these seemingly small comments and the diverse ways of seeing things acted like seeds that then grew in the team leader's mind, leading to significant intellectual development for him personally.
Exactly. The team leader himself acknowledged the profound impact of these interdisciplinary interactions, stating that his own thinking had been significantly broadened and that the theoretical work he was developing would not have been the same without the team's input.
That's incredible.
So, even if the team didn't always produce tangible group outputs that were immediately put into action, the very act of bringing these diverse minds together sparked individual insights and significantly advanced the team leader's understanding and theory building. That in itself was a huge value.
So as we start to wrap up this deep dive, what are the key things you want listeners to take away from this look at the NICE team's early experiences? What are the main lessons here?
There are several really important insights here, I think. First, it highlights how crucial it is to recognize and understand this idea of distributed cognition in any team setting. Thinking isn't just what happens in individual brains. It's a shared and interactive process happening across the group and its tools.
Right. Think bigger than just the people.
Second, we see the very real challenges involved in taking diverse perspectives and rich discussions and turning them into concrete, actionable outcomes. It's not always a smooth or straightforward process. Ideas can get lost, even good ones.
Yeah, the attitudes example really showed that.
Third, the role of leadership is critical in guiding and sometimes inevitably filtering the team's work. The leader's own focus and priorities can have a big impact on what the team ultimately focuses on, for better or worse.
And those tools we use to collaborate, like documents and meeting agendas, they can be both helpful and potentially hindering, right? Depending on how they're made and used.
Precisely. They have the potential to either make collaboration easier and more effective or to actually get in the way, depending on how they're created and how well they fit the team's collective needs. Tools that are created centrally might miss the mark for some team members, while tools that the whole team creates together might not always be consistently followed up on.
Okay.
Finally, and this is perhaps the most unexpected insight, we see the often unseen ways in which bringing different disciplines together can spark new ideas and advance understanding at an individual level, even if those breakthroughs aren't immediately obvious in shared documents or action items. Sometimes the real value of a team lies in its impact on individual thinking.
That's a fascinating point to consider. It really makes you wonder, in our own collaborations, are we actively encouraging this shared distributed thinking, or are we relying too much on individual contributions and a top-down approach?
That's the thought I'd like to leave you with. How might a better understanding of these cognitive dynamics, how ideas are shared, change, and sometimes disappear within a group, lead to more effective and innovative results in our own work and lives? Maybe, just maybe, the most valuable thing a team produces isn't always a shared document, but the seeds of new understanding that get planted in each individual's mind.
Definitely something to think about. If you're intrigued by these ideas and want to explore them more in your own team experiences, maybe consider how your meeting formats, the way you communicate, and how you develop shared tools might be better designed to really tap into the diverse thinking within your teams. It's a deep dive worth taking in your own collaborative endeavors.